Tonight on the Eclectic, we're going deep into the Rothiemurchus forest in the Scottish Highlands. The path is soft with pine needles, the air is cool and damp, and the dark line of the Cairngorms watches from a distance like a row of sleeping giants. At first, it feels like every other pretty Highland walk. There are families on the main track, dogs racing ahead, flashes of bright waterproof jackets between the trees. You can hear the low murmur of conversation, the clink of walking poles on stone, the occasional shout when a child gets too close to the water's edge. But gradually, as you keep walking, the voices thin out. The forest grows denser. The tourist boards and information plaques disappear behind you. The sound of tyres on gravel fades, and in its place you get the constant, soft shh of wind in the pine needles and the distant hiss of the River Spey. You're not lost, exactly. There is still a path, still the occasional waymarker, but there's a sense that you've stepped sideways, out of the ordinary, into the part of the landscape the postcards don't show. Up ahead, among the trees, the outline of a ruin appears. Low, moss-covered walls, a hint of doorways that lead nowhere. The remains of an old kirk and its little graveyard at the dune of Rothiemurchus. The graveyard itself is small, a scatter of stones, some upright, some tilting at odd angles, some sunk so far into the earth that only the top edge is visible. Dates are half erased. Lichen has eaten away at names. A few of the more recent stones carry plastic flowers bleached by the weather. And then you see it. It's not the tallest stone here. It doesn't shout for attention with an angel or a cross or a carved skull. In fact, if it weren't for what has been placed over it, you might not glance at it twice. A low, flat slab of stone, and around it, a square cage of iron bars driven deep into the ground. It looks wrong, like a tiny prison dropped into the middle of a quiet churchyard. There's enough space under the bars to see the grave itself, the weather-worn slab, and on top of it, 5 small, rounded stones. They're not random chunks of rubble. They're smooth, cylindrical, the kind of shape that speaks of hands over many years, placing them, lifting them, putting them back. People crouch down to peer between the bars. They whisper to each other. They take photos. If they know the story, they keep their hands very firmly to themselves. Because this isn't just any grave. This is the grave of Seath Mòr Sgorfhiachlach, a 14th century Highland warrior chief. According to local legend, those 5 small stones are cursed. Move them, steal them, even flick one out of place, and the curse will follow you home. There are stories of servants who mocked the curse and were found drowned, of journalists who laughed at it and never made it back down the road, of modern visitors who touched the stones and collapsed within days. Is any of that true? Did anyone really die because of what they did at this grave? And how did a man, dead more than 600 years, end up at the heart of a story so strong that people still cage his resting place just in case? This is the Eclectic, and tonight the cursed grave of Seath Mòr, the warrior, the homing stones, and the thin shifting line between known history and the stories we tell about the dead. Before we talk about curses and cages, I want to strip this story back to something simpler: a grave and the man who lies in it. If you've listened to the Eclectic for a while, you know I'm allergic to legends that pretend to be history. So let's be clear from the start. Seath Mòr is not a fictional bogeyman invented to scare hikers. There is a real historical core here. The name itself comes in several forms. Seath Mòr, sometimes Seath Mòr, and if you want to get fancy, Seath Mòr Sgorfhiachlach. The Mòr is a Gaelic element meaning great or big, so you can think of him loosely as Great Seath or Seath the Big. Seath is associated with the shores, a family who became a recognised branch of the Clan Chattan Confederation in the Central Highlands. We're looking at the late 1300s into the early 1400s, a period when Scotland is technically under a king, but real power outside the lowland burhs often sits with clan chiefs. This is not a peaceful era. Feuds, cattle raids, and local power struggles are very much a part of everyday life. The Shaws, or the ancestors of the Shaws, hold Rothiemurchus. This is their territory. Their burial ground at the Dune is where you'd expect a chief or a notable warrior to be buried. On Seath Mòr stone, at least before the weathering took its toll, there was an inscription that identified him specifically as victor in the combat at Perth. That's not a boast. This links him to a single notorious event, a formal staged clan combat that took place in 1396 on the North Inch of Perth. We'll come back to that battle in a moment, because it is the spine of the whole legend. For now, we'll stay in the graveyard. Physically, Seath Mòr's grave does not scream "cursed" on its own. In other contexts, the slab could look like many other medieval or early modern graves in the Highlands. The uniqueness comes from two things: the 5 stones and the cage. If you think about how graves are supposed to work, they're meant to be stable, permanent. You put up a gravestone for a loved one. You visit with flowers or tokens on anniversaries. The idea that there are 5 separate, loose, almost portable objects sitting on top of the grave, well, that is unusual. This invites questions. Who put them there? Why 5? Why that shape? Why are people so particular about them staying in place? You very quickly move from "this is a dead man's resting place" to curiosity. And once you introduce rules, especially rules like you must not move these objects, you create the perfect soil for a curse. The cage over the stones obviously fuels this further. Cages around graves in Scotland do exist historically, but the classic examples, called mort safes, were responses to body snatching in the 18th and 19th centuries. Fresh graves would be protected so that medical students and anatomists couldn't pay resurrection men to dig up corpses for dissection. Seath Mòr's cage is not that. His bones were centuries old before anyone thought about iron bars. The cage here is not about keeping a body in, it's about keeping the living out. In a sense, the grave you see today is not just Seath Mòr's. It's a collaboration between a medieval burial, later clan memory, and modern anxiety. Every time someone decided to put a stone there, or put a stone back, or finally bolt a cage around the whole thing, they added another layer to the story. But underneath those layers, there is still a core. A Highland warrior chief, aired around the early 1400s, claimed by his descendants and remembered as a champion in a very specific, very bloody fight. And that takes us to Perth, to a field called the North Inch, and to 30 men on each side walking into an arena in front of a king. Let's begin. The Battle of the North Inch of Perth is one of those events that sounds like fiction even before the folklore kicks in. If you pitched it as a scene in a TV series, a producer might tell you to tone it down. Here's the setup. Highland feuds were a constant headache for the Scottish crown. When rival clans raided each other, it wasn't just a local matter. It could spiral into broader instability and weakened royal authority. In 1396, a feud between what later sources call Clan Chattan and a rival group, sometimes identified as the Clan Cameron, sometimes as a branch of a clan called Clan Chwel, had reached a dangerous pitch. There were killings, there were retaliatory raids, the kind of low-level warfare that's devastating for everyone. The solution, as the royal court saw it, was to channel that violence into something controlled, something spectacular, something that would not only resolve the feud but do so in a way that asserted royal power and gave the lowland elites a shocking day out. So they organised a battle as if it were a tournament, picked men from one side, 30 from the other, to fight on the Northern Inch, a wide meadow by the River Tay just outside of Perth. The king, Robert III, would watch from a special stand. So would nobles and dignitaries. Think of it as a mix of trial by combat, a gladiatorial show, political theatre. The odd detail that often gets repeated is that one of the men on one side reportedly lost his nerve and failed to turn up. Rather than cancel the whole thing, they were said to have hired a stand-in, a local man, sometimes described as a harness maker, who agreed, for a fee, to fight in the line of 30. He allegedly survived by swimming the Tay when things got too intense, and disappears from history after that. The main fight, though, was anything but a joke. These men weren't playing with blunted weapons. They weren't scoring points. They fought, and they fought with real swords, axes, spears, and dirks. Contemporary chronicles describe the brutal close-quarters combat. The mass of bodies, the shock to the polite spectators as they watched Highlanders cut each other down with no quarter asked or given. When it was over, one side had effectively been wiped out. Only a handful on the other side were left standing, wounded but alive. The message was clear. The Crown had channeled the feud into one contained horror show and could claim to have resolved it. From a human perspective, it's appalling. From a storyteller's perspective, it's dynamite. Now, here, this is where Seath Mòr enters, not in the royal records of the day, but in clan tradition afterwards. He's described as a formidable warrior, over 6 foot tall, with a crooked grin that would strike terror into the hearts of even his own people. The Shores, as part of the Clan Chattan Confederation, claim that Seath Mòr Sgorfhiachlach was one of the champion on the Chattan side. In some telling, he is the key survivor, the man who can be pointed to as the victor in the combat at Perth. Modern historians are a bit more cautious. The primary sources we have for the battle, they don't actually list the names of the 30 men on each side. It is entirely possible that the link between Seath and the battle was made later as a way of anchoring clan identity to a dramatic national event. But whether or not a historian can sign off on it, with a big red tick, the tradition is powerful. In the Shore narrative, their ancestor went down to Perth as part of a hand-picked band of warriors, fought in front of a king, and walked off the field alive when most of his enemies did not. If you accept that story, you're not just visiting the grave of some guy in Rothiemurchus. You're standing over the remains of a man who, in his own community's memory, carried the honour of his people through one of the bloodiest episodes of medieval Scottish theatre. Add to that the idea of the Bodach and Dwayne, the old man of the dune, a kind of guardian or familiar spirit associated in some strands of lore with the Shore chiefs and their estate, and you begin to see how the haunting side of this develops. When the Shores lose Rothiemurchus to the Grants, the story goes that the Bodach shifts its attention from the house and the land to Seath's grave. Instead of watching over a living family, it watches over a dead champion. Now, we have a brutal public battle, a victorious warrior, a proud clan, a dispossessed estate, and a guardian spirit that has to go somewhere. All the ingredients you need for a curse are on the table. The missing element is the visible rule. The do this and something bad will happen. That arrives with the stones. At some point, and no one can give us a neat date, 5 small cylindrical stones are placed on top of Seath Mòr's grave. Were they there in the 1600s? The 1700s? Were they added in the Victorian era, when the antiquarian interest in Highland history began to boom? We don't actually know. What we do know is that by the time written accounts catch up, the stones are there, and people already treat them as significant. One of the most persistent early stories is the tale of the servant and the spey. It has all the hallmarks of a 19th century legend, a clear moral, a clash between local belief and the outsider arrogance, and just enough detail to feel plausible without ever quite becoming traceable. In one version, the man is an English footman in the service of an aristocratic visitor. often named as the Duke of Bedford. In another, he's simply a servant or traveller determined to prove a point. He is told, firmly, that the stones must not be moved. They belong to Seath Mòr. They are protected by the Bodach and Dwayne. Anyone who interferes with them courts disaster. The servant laughs. He might tease the locals for their superstition. He might say that if the stones are so powerful, they can come and find him. He goes to the grave, reaches under the bars, if the story is told after the cage is installed, or simply steps onto the slab in earlier versions, picks up one of the stones, and walks away with it. The next part is set at the River Spey, cold and fast-flowing even in decent weather. He throws the stone into the water. It vanishes with a splash. Depending on the storyteller, the man strides away triumphant, or he suddenly looks a little unsettled. But either way, he leaves. The following day, someone looks at the grave and realizes that something is wrong. One of the stones is missing, except a moment later, it isn't. All 5 stones are there in their proper place. There are no gaps, no sign anything was disturbed. And then a body is found in the Spey. It's the servant. He's drowned. Perhaps he slipped. Perhaps he misjudged the water. Perhaps he was pulled under by weeds. In the logic of legend, the interpretation is simple. Seath Mòr, or the Bodach guarding him, has taken revenge. The stone has come home, and the man who dared to throw it away has paid with his life. Folklorically, it's a perfect story. It fits neatly into a wider European tradition of homing sacred objects, relics or stones that come back to their rightful place when stolen. It reinforces local identity, the clueless outsider versus the wise locals who respect the old ways. And it warns the audience directly. This is not just a story about him, it is a story about what could happen to you if you behave the same way. Historically, it's a bit more murkier. We don't have a name, and we don't have a date. We don't have a newspaper report saying, "Footman in noble household mysteriously drowned after an argument over superstition in Rothiemurchus." If it's based on a real death, the details have been smoothed and shaped to fit the curse narrative. But once a community has this story, people become more cautious around the grave. Children are told not just, "Don't climb on that stone," but "Don't go near those stones, they're cursed." Visitors, well, they get a preemptive ghost story on the walk-in. More tales are told. A journalist lifts a stone, laughing about local beliefs, and dies in a car crash on the way home. A man moves the stones into a different pattern and falls ill within days. In each case, what matters for the curse is not proof, it's the emotional punch. You hear enough of these stories and suddenly those 5 little cylinders on the grave of a 14th century warrior, well, they start to feel charged. You don't have to believe in curses to hesitate before touching them. And as we move into the late 20th century, that hesitation collides with something else, a period when more people are travelling, more people are fascinated by the macabre, and more people are willing to test the limits of a local legend for the sake of a good story. By the 1970s, tourism in the Highlands is a very different thing from the horse and coach visits of the 19th century. Cars make it easier to get to places like Rothiemurchus. Guidebooks begin to mention oddities and curiosities alongside castles and lochs, and there's a growing appetite for what we would now call dark tourism. Haunted castles, execution sites, and cursed graves. Seath Mòr's grave, with its 5 mysterious stones and its growing body of folklore, is perfectly placed to attract that kind of attention. One name that surfaces repeatedly in modern write-ups is Leslie Walker. The story goes like this. Walker visits the graveyard and, either out of genuine curiosity or a desire to debunk the myth, decides to interact with the stones. He might pick one up, he might simply touch them. Shortly afterwards, he falls seriously ill. The illness is dramatic enough that he ends up in hospital for weeks. Later, a friend of his returns to the grave. He doesn't touch the stones, he rearranges them, maybe putting them in a straight line, maybe changing their pattern. Within a day, he suffers a catastrophic brain hemorrhage and dies, in some tellings actually collapsing in the cemetery itself. A third man who comes to identify the body experiences severe abdominal pains and is also hospitalized. It is, from a narrative standpoint, exactly what you would expect from a phase 2 of a curse legend. The old story about the servant and the river proves that the curse is real. The new story, with names and medical detail, well, that proves that it's still active. We're told all of this. However, we don't have the medical records, we don't have the newspaper clippings, and we don't have a death notice that explicitly mentions a connection to the grave. What we do have is a pattern. More and more people are treating Seath Mòr's grave not just as a historical curiosity, but as an active supernatural hotspot. Word spreads. Writers include the story in local histories, genealogical newsletters, and eventually blogs and articles online. YouTubers show up to film Scotland's most cursed grave. Social media creators post ominous walkthroughs of the cemetery with caption text about people who meddled and died. In the midst of all of this, something very practical happens. At some point around the late 1970s or early 1980s, all 5 stones are thrown into the River Spey. This isn't a legend. Multiple later accounts agree that the stones were found missing and that they were retrieved from the river by estate staff and members of the Shaw family, then replaced. We don't know who threw them in. It could have been vandals. It could have been someone who genuinely wanted to break the spell by removing the problem stones. Whatever the motive, the effect was the same, a real threat to the continuity of the legend and to a tangible piece of clan heritage. In response to that, an iron cage was erected around the grave. Not a solid box, but a grid of bars high enough to deter most people from reaching under and grabbing the stones. On a mundane level, it is a conservation measure. Keep people off the grave, keep the stones in place, and prevent further vandalism. On a narrative level, it's a visual shout. The cage says, "This grave is not like other graves. This grave is so important or so dangerous that we have to lock it up." Visitors who might have walked past an ordinary slab suddenly stop. What is this? Why is it caged? What happened here? If they don't already know the curse story, someone is very ready to tell them. If they do know it, the cage confirms it. The authorities were forced to act before people kept dying. That casual chain, stones touched, deaths happen, cage goes up, is never laid out in official documents. But the human brain is brilliant at inventing links where there may be none. The iron bars became part of the folklore machine. Fast forward to now, and you have layer upon layer of narrative. Visitors who claim they felt watched at the grave. People who report bad luck after mocking the story. Investigators who swear that their cameras glitched only at Seath Mòr's slab. Online, you can find highly produced videos leaning into the haunting, slow zooms on the cage while a narrator talks about the most cursed grave in Scotland. You'll also see more measured voices, locals and researchers who admit the stories are fascinating, but suspect that coincidence and retelling have done more of the work here than any angry Highland spirit. Which brings us to the final piece of our episode. What do we do with cursed graves when we care about both history and mystery? Seath Mòr's grave sits at a crossroads where several different forces meet. On the one side, there is genuine history, a clan, a territory, a probable 14th century chief with ties to a known battle. On another, there is a folklore, guardian spirits like the Bodach and Dwayne, homing stones, curses that fall hardest on the arrogant outsider. On a third, there is a modern media, travel writing, horror storytelling, YouTube, TikTok, podcast episodes, just like this one. All of those forces are powerful in their own way. Together, they make it very hard to disentangle what actually happened from what people now believe. If you approach the grave as a historian, you start with what you can reasonably verify. Seath Mòr likely lived in the 1300s and the early 1400s. The shores are historically associated with Rothiemurchus. The Battle of the North Inch did happen in 1396, and a group linked to the Clan Chattan did come out on top. An inscription on the grave recorded before weathering erased much of it refers to a victor in the combat at Perth. Everything beyond that is increasingly speculative. Was Seath one of the 30 fighters? Possibly. He's the man his descendants picked to credit. Did a servant throw a stone into the Spey and drown soon after? It's not impossible, but we don't have corroboration that would satisfy a court case, or a very picky podcaster. If you approach the grave as a folklorist, though, you're less concerned with whether every detail is literally true. You're interested in patterns. The idea of homing stones touches wider Celtic and European motifs, where sacred objects refuse to be taken from their proper place. Guardian spirits shifting their allegiance from a house to a grave. Well, that echoes similar beliefs in household spirits, light wights, and ancestral protectors. Curses that punish disrespect towards graves, that fits into a global pattern of stories that enforce norms about how we treat the dead. From that angle, the curse of Seath Mòr's grave is not unique at all. It is a local iteration of a global impulse to say, don't desecrate graves, don't mock what you don't fully understand. The dead still matter. Then there's psychology. If you visit a cursed grave and then get home safely, nothing happens to your belief. If you visit a cursed grave, laugh about it, and then something bad happens in the following days or weeks, the curse suddenly feels very real. We are extremely good at noticing coincidences that fit a narrative and ignoring those that don't. If 10 people touch the stones and one has a serious accident within the year, guess whose story will be told and retold? The 9 who went home and lived quietly don't get folded into the legend. There's also the power of suggestion. If you're warned that terrible things happen to people who mock Seath Mòr, you might be a fraction more anxious on the drive home. You might hesitate before overtaking. Ironically, that could make you safer, or, if you're constantly checking mirrors instead of concentrating, more at risk. None of this absolutely disproves the possibility of something uncanny at work, but it does offer straightforward, human explanations for at least some of what people report. So, where does that leave us, as people who love a good story but also care about getting things right? For me, Seath Mòr's grave is a reminder that history and legend are not enemies. They're layers. History always gives us the bones, the battle, the clan, the likely dates. But the legend, well, that gives us the muscle and the skin, the servant who mocked the stones, the journalist who held one aloft, Walker and his friends in the 1970s. Modern media adds the clothes and makeup, cages filmed at twilight, ominous music, thumbnails that promise the curse the authorities don't want you to know about. If we strip everything away and say, none of this matters unless it's provably true, we lose something. We lose insight into how people in the Highlands thought about the dead, about honour, about punishment and protection. We lose a chance to see how a community negotiates the presence of the past in a living landscape. If, on the other hand, we accept every dramatic story at face value and stop asking questions, We risk flattening a rich, complicated reality into a cheap jump scare. We turn Seath Mòr from a human being with whatever virtues and flaws he had into a cartoon villain who reaches out from the grave to kill tourists. Maybe the most respectful position sits somewhere in the middle. We can acknowledge that the evidence for specific cursed deaths is thin and that coincidence and storytelling probably did a lot of heavy lifting. We can also acknowledge that the feelings people have at that grave, the unease, the sense of weight or presence, the instinctive reluctance to stick a hand between those bars, are real. And we can choose how we behave accordingly. If you go to Rothiemurchus, you can visit Seath Mòr's grave. You can look at the 5 small stones laid out on a slab under the cage. You can think about a young man walking into an arena at Perth in 1396, wondering if he'll be one of the ones who walks out again. You can think about the Shores, proud of their champions centuries later. You can think about all the people who have stood where you're standing, trading ghost stories, debating whether curses are real. You don't have to believe the curse to treat the grave with care. You don't have to believe in the Bodach Gadwain to decide that maybe, just maybe, you won't test the stones today. In the end, the most powerful thing about Seath Mòr's grave might not be a supernatural force at all. It might be the simple fact that, hundreds of years after his death, his name, his story, and his resting place still have the power to change people's behaviour, and that, in its own, is a kind of haunting. You've been listening to The Eclectic. If you enjoyed this journey into the Highlands, half history, half haunting, feel free to share the episode, leave a review, and if you ever find yourself at Rothiemurchus, let me know. Did you visit Seath Mòr's grave? Did you keep your hands away from the stones? This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and as always, stay eclectic.